Good evening and welcome to For the Record. Tonight we take a look at the recent visits by two of the most prominent leaders in the world, the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi, and the President of China, Mr. Xi Jinping, who only today leaves our shores after a 3-day state visit. What does this mean for Fiji? How do we use this as a launching pad on the global arena, and where to from here? To discuss these questions in studio with us, we have the Associate Professor for Political Affairs at the University of the South Pacific, Dr. Sandra Tat, who's going to be talking about these recent visits and what we can expect in the future. Dr. Tat, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Firstly, Mr. Narendra Modi's visit, it comes after 33 years. The last Indian Prime Minister to visit was the late Miss Indira Gandhi. And for Modi to visit our shores is sort of described as a significant leapfrogging of Fiji between other nations in the region to become more prominent on a global scale. Is that a fair representation?
Thank you. I think India is a very different country to what it was 33 years ago when Mrs. Gandhi visited Fiji. And the world has changed considerably since then. And Fiji is also, of course, positioning itself very differently in the world. So what we're seeing now is Indian power starting to emerge, and in line with a whole new world order of new powers coming onto the scene, China, of course, among them. So what we're seeing with Fiji and India is a convergence of interests, where both these countries, and Fiji for the last 8 years now has been trying to build a new profile for itself internationally, and India is expanding its reach in the Asia Pacific, and it sees Fiji as very important within the region, obviously.
Where does this place Fiji in terms of our prominence in the region? Are we big brothers in the South Pacific now?
I think we have to be careful about the connotations of that term, big brother. I mean, historically, Fiji has played a leading role in the region, and the late Ratumara was a prime mover in the formation of the Pacific Islands Forum, or the South Pacific Forum as it was then, and a shaper of regionalism. And it was in order to promote the independence, the self-determination of the Pacific Island countries back in the early 70s or the late 1960s even. So Fiji, I think, assumed a very prominent role in the interest of asserting a more independent region. And I think what we're seeing now are certain parallels with Fiji's role in the region, leading the way, if you like, in carving a more independent foreign policy, not just for itself, but for other Pacific Island countries.
This whole ideal of self-determination was somewhat lost for quite a few years, you would agree?
I think so. The Pacific Islands Forum was the main platform for Pacific Island countries reaching out to the rest of the world. But over time, there seemed to be a loss of control, or at least a loss of ownership over the agenda of the Pacific Islands Forum, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years. And with the suspension of Fiji from the Pacific Islands Forum in 2009, it really opened the way, I think, for countries to start forming either alternative groupings or strengthening alternative groupings in order to forge their own regional approach to different issues.
So apart from advantages for us as a nation, as a trading partner, and as a people, there are ripple effects around the region when we have people like Mr. Narendra Modi and President Xi visiting our shores.
Definitely. And I think it's important that Fiji has provided this opportunity to our regional neighbors to meet these world leaders here in Fiji. And it's not just obviously for Fiji's benefit, it's for the broader regional benefit. And I think it's an apt opportunity as well for Fiji to build bridges with its neighboring countries, who, for some of them, there's been tensions obviously with Fiji in the last few years. So this hopefully will signal a strengthening or renewal of ties with some of our island neighbors. And I think we all agree we need to work together, collectively at the international level. And we were doing that quite well at the UN with the Pacific Small Island Developing States grouping. And that's formed quite a, I think, influential bloc, a more independent bloc for the region at the UN level. And we work together very well there. And we just need to make sure we do that well in the region.
So we need to basically make it trickle down to our own backyard.
Yes, and I think the formation of the Pacific Islands Development Forum which Fiji spearheaded several years ago, the idea was that that should be a kind of regional counterpart for the Pacific Small Island Developing States at the United Nations, and that the agendas of sustainable development and climate change in particular should be driven by the island countries, and that they should not be working perhaps through the Pacific Islands Forum so much, where their interests are not always seen to be well projected. So the Pacific Island Development Forum was supposed to be a grouping that could build on what was already happening successfully at the United Nations.
Let's go back to Fiji, India, and the visit by the Prime Minister. It took quite a lot of people by surprise, some even by shock, that Narendra Modi, one of the greatest leaders of the world, is coming to Fiji. Why? How? I mean, it sort of came all of a sudden out of nowhere. Nobody was expecting it. Was this a whimsical decision, or do you believe it has built up over time?
Well, I'm not privy to the decisions that were taken. Obviously, it was a coincidence, a happy convergence of events, and the fact that Mr. Modi was already going to be in Australia for the G20 summit, a grouping, by the way, that reflects a new kind of world order that has emerged, where there are a number of new economic powers on the scene, and a grouping that is now having quite a lot of influence globally. So he was going to be in our neighborhood, so to speak. Mr. Modi has also been quite proactive in terms of developing relations with neighboring countries. He's traveled quite extensively. He's probably got a much he's got a fresh approach to foreign policy, perhaps for India. Fiji and India have been building closer ties. We have an embassy in Delhi. We've now just had an election, so in a sense there is an opportunity to start not a new beginning, but we start from a footing where we have a democratically elected government and working with another, obviously, democratic government in India. So I think a number of things converged to provide this opportunity. And then there was the opportunity for Mr. Modi to meet with other Pacific Island leaders through at Fiji's instigation.
All right. On that note, it's time for a break. Excuse me. We'll be right back talking more about Fiji and the world. Welcome back to For the Record. We're speaking with Associate Professor Dr. Sandra Tat about Fiji's position in the international scene, given the visits by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and by the President of China, Mr. Xi Jinping. Dr. Tat, still with India and Fiji, for us there are a multitude of benefits to be closely linked with India, trading opportunities, aid, technical expertise. For India, what could be the underlying reasons for reaching out to the Pacific through Fiji more so?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, India is expanding its role globally. And this is a region which, there are 12 countries in our region who are members of the United Nations. And each of these countries has a vote at the United Nations. And one of the great, I think, assets for any country is to be able to, in a sense, leverage votes internationally. So for our region, if we work together as 12 countries and use those votes together, I think we have much more influence than we would otherwise. And this is an attraction for countries like India and China and various other states. So they see Fiji as important, and they see, through their relationship with Fiji, the opportunity to build closer relations with other Pacific Island countries. Fiji and India have a long-standing relationship, and it's been built up over many years. Perhaps not so much with India and other Pacific Island countries. So this is an opportunity for the Indian Prime Minister to show and to demonstrate through this visit that he is interested, India is interested in developing closer relations with the Pacific Island countries, and beyond that, cooperation perhaps at the global level. mutually beneficial cooperation at the global level.
And what can we achieve? What can Fiji achieve now that India has reached out and there's been talk of strengthening ties and working closely on a number of areas? What would you say would be some of maybe the top 3 sectors that Fiji would be hoping to get assistance in from India?
Well, it's interesting that technical assistance has always been a key component of relations between India and Fiji, and there's been an announcement of much increased number of scholarships to study in India. There's also been the announcement of diplomatic training for our foreign affairs personnel, and we perhaps have the opportunity with India being still a developing country, the opportunity to learn from India in many ways. I think this is the advantage of what is called South cooperation, which of course China is symbolic of as well. That these are still countries who see themselves as developing countries, even though they are major now economic powers, and the nature of their assistance can be more, in a sense, appropriate to the needs of small island developing states like our own. But Fiji is not just interested in aid and technical assistance, as you know. It's interested in other economic exchanges, and in particular trade and investment opportunities. They're a bit further away than China, so the question of tourism, for instance, is perhaps not as high on the agenda, but certainly we're hoping to benefit in terms of our profile being much higher now in India and beyond.
Would it be accurate of me to say that when there is a state visit like this, too in this instance, there is a ripple effect where, given a new profile and more exposure and prominence, there is more interest and more queries about investment and more visits, in fact, just because our name has popped up in association with people like Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi Jinping?
Definitely. I think that's the first step. It raises our profile, it raises awareness, and creates the, I think, interest that we need to attract economic partnerships. But we need to follow up on those, and that's I think the key thing. Both sides obviously need to follow up and facilitate the new either the new offers of assistance or the new ideas of how we can cooperate better. There need to be mechanisms put in place to facilitate that, whether it be follow-up visits, whether it be policy adjustments that need to be taken, supporting efforts that need to be made.
I'm keenly interested in how these visits place Fiji in terms of let's say Australia and New Zealand, which have been more influential in the region for a number of years. A number of the Pacific's ideologies and policies and international relations have pretty much been shaped by Australia and New Zealand. They've led the way. Have we come to a stage now, following these visits and following all the links that Fiji has formed? Have we come to a stage where Fiji can say, look, it's okay. We're in a position to make our own decisions and chart our own course?
Well, it's, as you said, this historically has been a Western-dominated region, the Pacific Island region. That's a legacy of our colonial past. And up until recently, yes, it was Western powers that really dominated the region and had influence in the region. And the Pacific regional organizations were very important for that purpose, because they allowed our Western partners to continue to influence the region in different ways, security-wise, economic-wise, and so on, and in terms of our diplomatic relations as well. But the region is changing, just as the world is changing. And it's no longer just the Western powers that have influence here. And the key non-Western power now, of course, is China. That's emerging as a very major influence in our region. And it's been happening now for quite some time. And Fiji has, of course, recognized that since for the 10 years or more now, since the Look North policy was launched in 2001, We opened an embassy in Beijing in 2001. China's been a crucial, component of our relations, our Look North policy strategy. And it's really, this visit by President Xi is really a culmination of that strengthening relationship that's been developing, building over time. And it reflects, as I said, the changing region, Asia-Pacific region, and the global order as well.
All right, with that, it's time to take another break. We will be back very shortly. More discussions coming up. Welcome back to For the Record. We are speaking about Fiji's position in the international arena, given recent visits by the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, and the visit by the President of China, Mr. Xi Jinping. For discussions in studio with us tonight is the Associate Professor for Political Affairs at the USP, Dr. Sandra Tart. Dr. Tart, through the course of discussions this evening, we've sort of come to China now, India and Fiji. We've had quite a few discussions about, but as you mentioned earlier, China has always been a very strong partner of Fiji. Is this something that Fiji did intentionally after being, sort of left out of the loop by our traditional partners?
Well, I wouldn't say China has always been a strong partner of Fiji. We established diplomatic ties with People's Republic of China in 1975, and we were the first Pacific Island country to do so. And an embassy of People's Republic of China was established in Fiji, I think, the next year. But it was not a very sort of major influence on our foreign policy for, I would say, the next 20 years or so. We also maintained semi-official ties with Taiwan, and that was always an issue that, in a sense, perhaps inhibited our close relationships with the People's Republic. However, it was in the 1990s when we started to see relations develop with China, and this was a period also of intensifying rivalry between Taiwan and China in the South Pacific for recognition. And then in the aftermath of the 2000 coup, when Fiji was isolated again from its traditional partners, it made a conscious decision the following year, in 2001, to launch what was known as the Look North policy. And this was definitely as a way to meet the challenges facing Fiji at the time economically, due to its loss of economic ties with some of its established partners. And it was also recognizing that the region was changing, and it was good politics to start diversifying our partnerships. So Fiji, at that time under the Prime Ministership of Mr. Garase, developed quite an active foreign policy towards China, and China reciprocated because it was strategically in China's interest to do so. And of course, the key thing for China has always been to maintain Fiji's position on One China policy, that is recognition of the People's Republic of China and that Taiwan is part of China. Now, there have been in the past tensions, as I mentioned, because Fiji has enjoyed also quite cordial ties with Taiwan, and there is a Taiwan Trade Office in Fiji, which is a conduit for some technical aid and assistance, and Fiji's valued that relationship. But I would say certainly since 2006, in the aftermath of the coup that year, and when the Bainimarama government came into power, we've seen a much greater strengthening of the relationship with China, and this is again in the context of an adverse diplomatic and economic relationship with our partners, developed nations partners, and it was also it was to fill a gap, and I think it's very important to point out that Fiji was never trying to shun Australia and New Zealand in that process. It was just trying to reach out because it was placed in a very difficult situation.
Has this paid dividends, the decision to reach out to China? We always hear about all this aid that's coming in, assistance and grants from China. But is there a deeper benefit and payoff for having this close relation?
Well, on the economic front, we have, over the last 15 years, received quite a bit of aid from China. And in 2006, Fiji actually hosted a summit here in Nandi, where the Premier of China, Mr. Wen, presided, and this was for Pacific Island countries as well as Fiji. And there was a major aid or economic partnership announced at that meeting. And last year in November, there was another summit in Shanghai, where the Chinese government made a further major aid and economic cooperation announcement for the region. And so China has been increasing its economic aid to the region quite considerably in the last 10 or so years, and it now rivals some of the established aid partners in the Pacific. But I think there's an important point here that this aid is not always utilized, and even in the case of Fiji, there are announcements of aid, but it's the question of having the capacity or the procedures in place to utilize that aid. And this is the same for some of our Pacific Island neighbors, where their capacity to actually absorb large amounts of aid is somewhat limited. So for Fiji, there's the economic assistance component, but I think far more important for Fiji is the trade and investment links with China and tapping into the tourism market. Because Fiji is not an aid-dependent country in quite the same way as our neighboring island countries are. And so we really want to use this relationship with China to build our economic growth and our exports and our infrastructure development and investment, and create jobs. Yeah? So this is the priority, I think. For
China
us.
has some of the largest number of people traveling outside for holidays. They travel in bulk, and they're seen as quite big spenders right now. What sort of potential are we looking at given distance and travel?
Well, Australia is a huge destination market for Chinese tourists, and I think New Zealand is also quite significant. So, we're not talking great distances, especially if there are direct flights. It's whether we have the hotel capacity and the other attractions that would lure Chinese tourists to Fiji. And I think initially there was some skepticism about whether we would be able to absorb huge numbers of tourists from China, or whether they would be interested in coming to Fiji. But as China changes, as society changes, there's an emerging middle class that aspires to lifestyles that we see in other developed countries. I think we will see the growth of a tourism market, and that destinations like Fiji, which are pristine environmental countries that have things that China doesn't have. So I think we will be a niche market for tourists from China, and perhaps there'll be some way of tapping into the tourism between Australia or New Zealand and China.
We're basically a hop away from Australia anyway. Well, with that, we take another break. We'll be right back. Bulawanaga, Fiji. Welcome back to For the Record. We are talking about Fiji's position in the global arena, given the visits by two global leaders. In studio with us is Dr. Sandra Tart, the Associate Professor for Political Affairs at the University of the South Pacific. Dr. Tart, quite a range of discussions we've had tonight. When we look at Fiji and the Pacific Island Forum, for a number of years, we weren't included. Fiji, which was seen as a major voice in the forum, as you brought up earlier, brainchild of the late Ratus Kamisese Mara, for us to be excluded from the forum, from our neighboring countries, and pretty much, the child that nobody wants to play with in the playground, for us to have come out of that and positioned ourselves as, if I may say, a force to be reckoned with in our part of the world. How much work did that take? Do you expect?
Well, we were, I think, at a critical juncture in 2009 when Fiji was suspended from the Pacific Islands Forum, which was an unprecedented move by the regional organization. I think it came at a moment, though, when the region itself was starting to question the way things were going. It was a crucial year in the sense that there was growing disaffection, I think, within the forum, and particularly with the role of Australia and New Zealand in the forum, in driving the regional agenda in a direction that countries were not entirely happy with, whether it be in the area of trade, or in the area of aid, or in the area of climate change negotiations. So I think the countries of the region were probably ready to see some new direction. And when Fiji was suspended from the forum, it created that opportunity, and Fiji became the catalyst for a lot of changes that took place. It wasn't the only mover and shaker in the region, I should add, but it certainly had an important role to play. And it, in a sense, it showed what was possible. So Fiji was building new relations globally. It was also building new or strengthening partnerships regionally. And this was to counter its perceived isolation at the time. But it was occurring at a very, I think, pivotal moment historically for our region. And what we're seeing now is a new direction, a new trend in regional relations. The fact that these meetings of world leaders have taken place in Fiji outside the framework of the Pacific Islands Forum is important, I think, because it shows that the diplomatic arena is changing, whereas the forum has traditionally been where world powers or where the outside world interacts with the region. That's not the case anymore. So Fiji's provided openings that I think have been very important.
When you say openings, what have we opened ourselves up to with this new global approach?
Well, at the UN, I think the important thing is that Fiji was behind the formation or helped create the new grouping at the United Nations where Pacific Island countries work together. That's the Pacific Small Island Developing States Group. So whereas before it was the Pacific Islands Forum grouping, the problem with that was that Australia and New Zealand were part of that. And so it was not genuinely a developing country grouping at the UN, within the UN system. So the fact that the Pacific Small Island Developing States was able to emerge in the UN system has created I think the potential to have a lot more, to be lot more proactive on the world stage. And in areas which I think have key interests for the Pacific, such as sustainable development agenda and climate change. And then at the regional level, I think Fiji's leadership of the Melanesian Spearhead Group for the years 2011 to 2013 coincided with a period of great activism by the MSG, and Fiji also led the way with the Pacific Islands Development Forum being created.
You mentioned Fiji helping the formation of a new grouping. Fiji has also chaired the G77 and has chaired a number of executive boards, to my recollection, in the UN. To be able to do that, to be in a position where Fiji is given these leadership roles in the United Nations of all organizations, would take a lot of hard work to get to that stage. I mean, there was a point in time we would attend the UN meetings, we would vote, and that would be it. Now we are chairing boards, we are seen to be making a difference, would you say?
Well, Fiji can't make a difference on its own. Fiji has to work with groups. And I think one of the strategies has been, apart from the Pacific Small Island Developing States Group, is to align with or to join groupings that are going to be important and influential blocks at the global level. The G77 plus China was one that Fiji was already part of as a developing country, but it was able to position itself with the support of other groupings to become the chair of that grouping in 2013. Fiji is outside the UN, of course, also joined the non-aligned movement, which is a significant network of states as well, which brings us into contact with countries we may not necessarily have ties with. But the other thing is Fiji's been trying to formalize diplomatic relations with a large number of countries, not because we necessarily anticipate building closer relations with those countries, but we need that formal diplomatic relationship if we are to work together perhaps in the future on issues of concern to Fiji. So it's about networking. And I think the other key thing is that Fiji has developed, and the Pacific Small Island Developing States grouping as a whole, a strategy of working with countries that are powerful and influential.
Are we going out there and saying, when we form these new diplomatic relations, are we sort of sending the message, we are friends to all?
That is the motto. That is the motto. And, the Bainimarama government very early on wanted to reach out and promote greater global integration. And it was the right time to do that. The world was changing, as we said earlier. The opportunities were opening up. So I think Fiji is capitalizing on them very effectively. And I think the benefits do flow on to the region. But there is, I think, a danger here that Fiji perhaps overstates its so-called preeminence. There are sensitivities, and I think historically that's always been the case. Fiji can do a lot of good as a regional leader, but it has to recognize the sensitivities of our neighboring countries, that Fiji is not too presumptuous about its role.
All right, we'll have more discussions in a while. Time now for another break. Good evening and welcome back. We'll go right back into discussions. Dr. Tad, before the break, you were talking about the sensitivities of diplomacy. Fiji has, in recent years, gone into international meetings, has spoken on the global arena and basically said, look, don't treat us like insignificant little, portions of the world. We matter. We have a voice. And what we say comes from a people with a vision and ideals, and a people with problems. Are you saying that we may have overstepped the bounds a few times in a few meetings? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think Fiji's got the interests of the region at heart when it talks about independence for the region and self-determination and being able to have a voice, as you said, globally. You have to remember that in the early days after the formation, or at the time when the SAPSUC Forum was formed, Fiji assumed a leadership role because it was able to do that. And there were questions, though, at the time whether Fiji was doing this to benefit itself only, or whether it was genuinely interested in the welfare of the region. And there were also concerns that Fiji was trying to control the agenda of the region and was concerned, for example, about the emergence of Papua New Guinea as a rival for leadership of the region. And when Ratumara, the late Ratumara, spoke against the idea of Papua New Guinea joining the SAPSUC Forum before it was independent, that was interpreted by some to mean that Ratumara was wary of Papua New Guinea being a rival and a challenge to Fiji. But the position that Ratumara took was that no, the SAPSUC Forum was a body of decision makers, of leaders, and those who could make decisions as sovereign states. Papua New Guinea was not a sovereign state at that time. So he stood very firmly for self-determination, and that the island countries could control their affairs. And what we see today, I think, is similar, and that the Bainimarama government is trying to assert a more independent line for the region. And the problem is that the perception sometimes can be that this is for Fiji's benefit, and that it might, in a sense, be at the expense of other countries in the region. So I think that's the key thing. We have to be sensitive to these perceptions.
This talk about being independent and self-determination, and the fact that Fiji is going out there and telling the world that the South Pacific should be left to make its own decisions on where it wants to go. Do you feel this would be making certain parts of the world uncomfortable?
Well, it makes our region a very interesting place because, as I said earlier, if there are 12 countries using their 12 votes at the UN together, that can make a much bigger impact than individual countries and acting on their own. And so if the region does mobilize and does decide to act more independently, that creates all all sorts of opportunities and possibilities. So that's, I think, of interest to countries like China, India, and those further afield even.
There's a quote from the chief executive of ANZ, Mr. Vishnu Mohan. He was reacting to the visits by Mr. Modi and by President Xi. To quote him, he said, we are living in the Asian century, and for these leaders to visit Fiji is very significant. Now, of course, I can't ask you to read his mind, but what can we interpret from that, Fiji being included in the Asian century?
Well, the Asian century or the Pacific century, it's had different terms. You know, we have this grouping called APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and that's virtually all the countries on the Pacific Rim. And I think what's been quite striking in the past is that Pacific Island countries who are in the very center of the Pacific are excluded or absent because they're seen as too small, too insignificant to count. Only Papua New Guinea has any voice within APEC. And Papua New Guinea has in the past sought to represent the Pacific Island countries in that forum. I think the visits by Mr. Modi and President Xi signifies that we are now recognized as existing as, you know, as part of the Asia Pacific region. We're not just the hole in the donut as we have been in the past. So the fact that Fiji is being a much more active player internationally, I think, is probably helping to shape the perception of the Asia Pacific as not just being countries on the rim, but countries within the Asia Pacific, within the Pacific Ocean area.
Back home, the foreign ministry, our entire foreign policy, our diplomatic corps, all of this has been under rigorous reform and improvement over the years. Would you be able to tell me how we were a couple of years ago and how we are today in terms of a foreign entity? Well, excuse me, I've confused the question. How our foreign policies and our diplomatic corps has changed?
We have, I think, 8 new embassies that have been opened. We have the biggest number of embassies of any Pacific Island country in the world. This is strategic. It's about expanding our presence in areas of the world where we weren't previously present. Now, I think that's an important dimension of any foreign policy, to have a presence and to have representation. But obviously it requires the capacity to support those missions, both in human resources and in financial capacity. So it's created a much bigger demand on our foreign service. And I think the demand also for probably more professionalism as well. We need more professional diplomats. We need more experienced diplomats. And we can't rely on a process of ad hoc appointments that Fiji has traditionally relied on when it came to diplomatic postings. Because one of the important things now is that as people work in the diplomatic service, they acquire experience that we need to build on, we need to retain. We can't afford to lose that to other perhaps areas of government or private sector. So, you know, I think we are moving down a path of greater professionalization, and we need to continue that.
Let's look at Fiji. If you were to mark a trend in the world and the Pacific, our prominence and how we're being given recognition, and you know, these leaders are coming in. There's more talk around the Pacific, more talk around climate change, more talk about cooperation and economy and trade. If you were to mark a trend, where would you put Fiji if the trend is going upwards? Where is Fiji on the trend? Are we leading it? Are we causing this trend?
Well, we're living in a world where there are so many global issues now that need attention and that we are all in some way affected by. You mentioned climate change. We hear a lot about the challenges of climate change here in the Pacific and the impact that it's already having on our region. But we also need to know that there is a process of international diplomacy around climate change, and we need to be very actively involved in that. And you know, the Pacific Island countries tend to work through different groupings. There is not necessarily one unified position when it comes to climate change negotiations. The important point, I think, being made by Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi is that they're willing to cooperate with our region and with countries like Fiji on climate change. And I don't think it's just about more assistance, more aid. I think we need to talk about how we can cooperate in the negotiation process itself, particularly coming up next year with the Paris conference.
Just lastly, before we wrap up, how do we use these developments, these visits, and our prominence now in the future?
We will certainly, I think, see this as not a new beginning, but perhaps a turning point for our foreign policy. It's very significant that it's happened just after the election, when we have some certainty for the next 4 years, some stability politically. And I think this is an opportunity, obviously, for the government to really capitalize on and build on the foreign policy achievements that it's had over the last 6 years or so. So I think we will see perhaps greater confidence. It's interesting that the Prime Minister has exhorted our ambassadors to work even harder. I'm sure they work very hard as it is to get more results. You know, it's not going to be a slackening off. It's going to be intensification, if anything, of our international relations. And it's probably a very exciting time to be working in that area.
Dr. Ta, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
And that was For the Record this evening. Remember, if you have any comments or questions, you can email fortherecord@fbcnews.com.fj. That's the show for tonight. We'll be back again next Sunday. Until then, good night.